You're listening to a Thames Estuary Partnership podcast, celebrating London's famous tidal river. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Talk of the Thames. I'm your host, Chloe Russell. And welcome to this two-part episode of Life Under the Thames. This episode brings you with us to an estuary edge to discover what life is hidden in the water. Today we are doing fish surveys and we are joined with TEP Data and Training Manager Wanda Bodnar and fisheries expert Steve Kolkler to walk us through the whole process of fish surveys. I hope you enjoy this first part of this special trip in the field.
And unless there's a huge amount of fresh water flowing in the river from heavy rain, it just sort of sits there for about half an hour. And it's the tide coming in starting to balance the freshwater flow trying to get out. So it just does nothing for about half an hour. So it's slightly later than that, and in fact if you look just upstream, there's a stone there in the river. See the V shape on it. Facing that way, the tide is already pushing in that way. But because we're in a little bay here, it's slightly protected from it. So I'm just going to run this out in a little semicircle and come around. That's the technique, that's the theory. It should be ready to come straight out, but I'm going to use a rope first just to get out to the depth I want to get to. You might think it's a tiny net, it's only 15 metres long. But the fish aren't silly, they don't like strong tidal flows. So it's little back eddies, they're sitting in here. At least the smaller one.
We are at Battersea Reach, just east of the mouth of the River Wandle. And we are here to visit an estuary edge site, and we are actually in the middle of a fish survey to see how fish actually utilize these sites.
All of those fish are young of the year fish, which is classic for an estuary. But as is sometimes the case, we just found something new to science, because one of those is a little baby zander is an exotic, it shouldn't be here. We know it's in the freshwater Thames. Last year we found a few down at Point Wharf, Greenwich. It's the first one I think that's ever been reported from the middle city reaches. They do like estuaries, so we're going to see more of them.
Can you tell us, what are estuary edges?
Right, so the UK government guidance on biodiversity requires now riverside developers to protect and enhance the biodiversity in their schemes, particularly focusing on priority habitats such as mudflats, saltmarsh and reedbeds. And a way to do this is by the creation of these man-made vegetated intertidal terraces to soften the hard built-up edges of the estuary to improve the environment both for fish and other wildlife. At the moment there are 17 estuary edge sites between Dartford and the River Wandle, and these sites were built between 1997 and 2012. Perhaps the most well-known is the one at the O2, the Millennium Terraces, that was built in 1997. And there, what's interesting, that actually the developer allowed 10 meters of its land to be given back to the sea. And so that's where those reed beds are running, parallel with the riverside. It's quite long, a few hundred meters actually. But in terms of just finding about all of these estuary edges a bit more, there's a dedicated website, which is estuaryedges.co.uk, which gives an overview of the estuary edge design principles as well as detailed case studies. And the idea is that we do like maybe 3 of these, and then afterwards we can it's all in a bucket now, and then each seine netting would get their own bucket, and then in that way we can identify all the fish and just make a note how many seine netting we've done, which which catch had which kind of species, etc.
What's the significance of the estuary edges? Why are they so important?
So basically in the last 2,000 years, the Thames Estuary area got built up extensively. We modified it, we straightened and narrowed down the river channel. And with that, we stripped away important habitats such as saltmarsh, seagrass and reedbeds. And in fact, the Thames used to be a much more marshy and densely wooded system with many small channels and islands. And these channels and islands basically provided an opportunity for fish to actually hunker down and wait for the tidal cycle, not get washed away. But we don't have these anymore. In fact, only around 1% of the tidal banks are natural, and that can be found at Syon Park. And so the riverside area in London is made up of mainly vertical concrete walls, which are predominantly there to conceal the sewer system and also act as a flood defense. And so these walls provide very little opportunity for migratory fish to actually be able to hang on to it and not get washed away by the tide. And so putting these vegetated areas in is actually really helping these creatures, especially those that move through the estuary at one or other stages of their life. And of course, these habitats carry a lot of so-called ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are those that us, the human society, actually benefit from. This includes the slowing down of the river flow, also reducing the flood risk, which is something that London will have to deal with in the future. And they also act as a carbon capture and sink. They improve water quality, and of course provide a nursery ground for fish as well. And of course, for us, these sites are making the visit of the Thames Estuary more accessible and attractive. And as you highlighted in that episode last year, the Blue Mind episode, where we all learned that actually being near water is really good for our mental health and well-being, coming down to these vegetated areas, just sitting by it, looking at the river, we all benefit from it, really.
This is designed around looking at small fish in the margins. No single method will show you everything. They're all showing you something slightly different. So this is a good general one for young of the year fish sitting in the margins. And another interesting thing is why they're sitting in the margins. That baby bass has been born somewhere in the southern North Sea. He's probably 8-10 weeks old. He can't swim very well. He just knows what the tides do. A lot of Londoners don't realise high water, throwing a tennis ball at Tower Bridge. It goes down 13 kilometres. It comes back 12.5 on the next flood. That tennis ball takes 3 months to go from Teddington to Southend, and little fish know all about that. So instead of having to swim against the tide, particularly if you're a flounder or a benthic species like that, like the common gobies who are born near Canvey Island as well, they sit on the bottom while the tide's rushing out. As soon as the tide starts to lift, they just get into the flow and do a 13-kilometre surf. High water, they just sit on the bottom, wait out the next ebb and do it. So they're using these foreshores as a series of stepping stones. And it's these sort of surveys that have demonstrated for the first time that's how they're actually doing it. Before that, we didn't know how, say, a baby flounder that's that big was at Teddington only 6 weeks after he was born. They are very clever. Yeah.
I think we're all wondering, when you say fish, what sort of fish are we talking about?
The Thames Estuary is a very dynamic environment. We have fresh water coming down from upstream, from the tributaries, and we have the sea coming in twice a day as well. And so we can sort of distinguish between different zones based on the salinity of the water. So roughly from Teddington, which is the tidal limit, up to roughly down to here, actually, to Battersea, is fresh water. And then below that, roughly down to Greenwich, is brackish. So it's a bit of mix of fresh and salt. And beyond that is going to be salty water. And so basically a lot depends on the amount of fresh water that was coming down. So, for example, the last couple of days were quite rainy, so we might find fish, or we have found already fish, which tend to be freshwater, but also those who are tolerating all kinds of salinity. And so the season can also be something where different fish species would be found, and also the tidal cycle. In 2017, there was a fish survey here where the three main species found were the sea bass, the common goby, and the European eel. And then we already done our seine netting here this morning. And then we found, again, we found sea bass, we found roach, dace, three-spined stickleback, pike perch or zander, flounder as well. These are just off the top of my head at the moment. So there's quite a few that we found. So we're just going to move this stuff a little bit closer to where we came down, and then we can process them. So thank you.
How do you carry out the fish survey? What's involved?
The first thing you need to understand is how the tides are moving. As Wanda has just said, the fish are moving with the tides. So you have to understand how they're moving with the tides to work out the best time to sample them. What we generated during the 1990s for what became the Water Framework Directive was a standard sampling methodology where you go to a particular beach at low tide, nice clean gravel beach, and you use one method called a seine net, which is a curtain of netting, which you lay out in a semicircle from the shore and pull it in. That tends to catch some of the medium and small size fish which are swimming in the margins. We then used to use a small beam trawl off the back of a boat. Now those methods still go on for Water Framework Directive, but what we're doing here as a citizen science approach is something slightly smaller but still with the same idea of a multiple method technique, using a 13-metre seine net which has very small 3mm mesh walked from the shore, and then we've set 3 fixed nets in the intertidal vegetated habitat. Now these fixed nets have wings attached to them, and we face them up the slope. Now again, we need to understand how the fish use the site in order to catch them. Fish come not just up the river on the tides, they come up the margins as well, coming from the deeper water into the margins to feed. And the vegetated margin is actually their preferred habitat. So we now know that intertidal habitats with vegetation are the prime habitat for the early life stages of species like sea bass. They can get away from predators, they can get into shallow, warm water, lots of refuges available, and lots of food. So these fish come in on the tides to get into these areas. As soon as high water turns and the water starts to retreat, the fish get onto the bottom and get out quickly. So if we set these fixed fight nets, we call them, with their wings facing up the slope and put them in the right place, as the fish come in, they ignore it. As they turn to leave on the ebbing tide, they tend to get caught in our nets. All the fish we take are captured, measured and identified, and then returned to the water. Most published textbooks have very good library pictures of the adults. One of our challenges here is we're dealing with very small specimens of certain species. So, for example, although most people could identify an adult sea bass if they buy one at the fishmongers, it's literally a bar of silver. A baby sea bass, smaller than about 2.5 centimetres in length, looks nothing like that. It has a completely see-through body with a black edging to it. So you might think you're looking at something completely new. So what we've done with colleagues in ZSL and elsewhere is amass a whole series of photographs of different life stages and put them into an easily accessible guide. But even then, if you've never seen these species before or seen that guidebook, it is difficult to identify. And particularly when fish are very small, as I say, with the sea bass and with other species, they don't necessarily look like the adult version at all.
So we had the free seine netting, and then each of the samples had their buckets. So we got the buckets lined up knowing 1, 2, 3. And then he's just going to get some things. So we will fish out the fish. And then individually identify them, the species to species level, and then measure them and then also count. Well, the counting is at the end, but counting also counts.
What happens when you collect all this data? Where does it go afterwards?
So we note down everything we can do. So we measure the fish, we identify the fish, and then we count the fish. And then we house it at the Thames Estuary Partnership. And of course we share it with our partner organizations, which are in case the Port of London Authority, the Environment Agency and the Institute of Fisheries Management. And then secondly, we use it to actually demonstrate it towards developers how and what kind of fish species are actually using these sites, highlighting the fact that these are ecological. These sites are beneficial when it comes to the ecology of the river. And we found sea bass during the survey this morning. And sea bass is a commercially important species, and the Thames Estuary is actually the largest sea bass nursery in the south of England. So that's just an example of highlight the ecological value of these sites.
I think for everybody wondering, besides fish, what other wildlife can you get around Estuary Edges?
Sure. I mean, Steve, do you want to just say some other examples of fish before I go on to that?
Oh, other examples of fish, yes. Well, from the freshwater background, we often find roach, as we saw today. I think we found 2 small bream today as well. Perch is another species commonly found in the inner part of the estuary. And with the more estuarine species, smelt is a classic one that runs up the river to spawn at Wandsworth in April, May each year, and then spends most of its life in the lower estuary. We've seen a flounder today, but in the lower estuary there are all sorts of other flatfish species like plaice and dab. Some of the shark species like dogfish and starry smoothhound will come into the lower parts of estuaries as well. So estuaries are a great mix, basically, of everything. Most of them are freshwater in this part of the river, but estuarine species will come up here. Marine species tend not to come much above the city. They want a bit more salinity than they find up here. And this is all highly seasonal. I think Wanda touched on this before. Some of these fish migrations are very seasonal indeed. At the moment, the bass fry migrations are on, and we will see multiple waves of bass fry coming from different spawning sites in the southern North Sea. They're all about between 15 and 30 millimetres at the moment in size. By the time they get to about 80 millimetres in, say, October, most of them will be right up at Teddington or Richmond. It starts to get a bit wetter and a bit colder, and they drop straight back to the estuary, lower estuary. So that's what estuaries do. They're major nursery grounds, but they're migratory corridors as well for a huge range of species.
Other than these fish species, of course, the Thames Estuary is actually home to over 300 species of invertebrates, 96 species of birds, the 3 species of mammals, which are the harbour seal, grey seal and the harbour porpoise. And of course, Steve already mentioned the shark species. The Thames being part of the global ocean, of course, it's no surprise that we can have sharks here. These are there's 3 species that I would highlight. Is the taupe, one of them, the starry smoothhound, which Steve already mentioned. These will commonly feed on crustaceans, and the spar duck or the spiny dogfish, which will actually feed on small flounder, plaice, and also small crustaceans.
Excellent. Well, a big thank you for both your contributions today. It's been a fantastic day out, and we hope that you've enjoyed it as much as everybody listening. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed this short sound capsule of what it's like during a fish survey. And join us next time for the second part of this episode of Life Under the Thames, when we speak to Steve Colcler more in depth about his 40-year career in the field. You can expect to find out his career highlights, challenges, and how he keeps up to date in the field. Again, thank you very much for listening to this episode, and we hope you've enjoyed it. This episode has been brought to you by me, Chloe Russell, on behalf of the Thames Estuary Partnership, and we most look forward to welcoming you next time. Bye for now.